Our next guest has published personal essays in Dogwood and Tri-Quarterly. Her essay, A Gold Mine, was nominated for a Pushcart and received a notable mention in Best American Essays 2014. She has performed at Story Club, Guts and Glory, Essay Fiesta, Story Sessions, and the Bodies of Work Festival, among other live lit shows. She's very slowly writing a collection of essays exploring the experiences of women living with invisible and visible disabilities. But she's been a little distracted from her writing since buying Women and Children First, one of the last remaining feminist bookstores in the country. As the store's co-owner, she has been featured in New City's Lit 50 issue and in Publishers Weekly Star Watch, an annual list that recognizes 40 youngsters within the U.S. book trade who have distinguished themselves as future leaders of the publishing industry. Please welcome Sarah Hollenbeck.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, just down the street from the store. All right. In either first or second grade, my school held Disability Awareness Day. On that day, scattered around our classroom were activities intended to replicate what it would be like to live like that. There were earplugs to mimic deafness, blindfolds for blindness. There were wheelchairs, crutches, walkers, casts. Each station was so much fun. At the blind station, you could run into stuff. And at the deaf one, you could shout at the top of your lungs. As my assigned partner and I rotated through the stations, our laughter escalating, I caught sight of the last station and grew suddenly uneasy. It looked simple. There was a table, and on the table there were paper cups, each filled with marshmallows. When my partner and I approached the station, the adult who had volunteered to supervise it looked at me, and the uneasiness in my stomach slid across her face. She instructed us to stuff the contents of each cup into our mouths. We did as we were told, one marshmallow, then two. The flustered adult, her eyes fixed on the lower half of my face, started to say something, but then stopped. Instead, she handed my partner a list of words and told him to read those words aloud. I was supposed to guess what he had said. Then we would switch. This, she explained, was what it was like to have a speech impediment. I was born with underdeveloped cranial nerves, partially paralyzing the muscles in my face. Due to this condition, I cannot close my mouth or smile, and my lips barely move, so in order to talk, my tongue does all of the heavy lifting. My older sister, Annie, was born with the same syndrome, and she once visited a speech pathologist who, after running some basic tests, said that Annie had mastery of only 14 sounds. There are 44 sounds in the English language. I have a speech impediment. Not long ago, I read an interview with a man who has facial paralysis. The interviewee said that he experienced severe anxiety and depression, which he attributed to the fact that his family always acted as if nothing was wrong. Once the man went out into the world and found this not to be the case, he couldn't cope. The interviewer described this man's childhood as having been enchanted. I know this enchantment. I grew up in a beautiful white house shaded by a giant sycamore tree. Inside, the bookshelves were full, dinners were candlelit, bedtimes were flexible, and family dance parties were frequent. My mother was cool. She listened to Patti Smith records at midnight. She wore a Thelma and Louise t-shirt to bed, and she called Republicans assholes. My father is kind. He read my sisters and me bedtime stories every night, and every morning he packed our lunches in brown paper bags that he hand-decorated every day. Inside, our house, to me, always felt like a bunker. Inside the bunker, we didn't talk about certain things. We didn't talk about the game that the other kids played at school called Sarah Jones, no tapbacks. We didn't talk about the small, wet spot of drool that stained the fronts of all of my shirts. We didn't talk about the times our family went out to eat at restaurants and children at the tables next to ours would mimic the way that Annie and I ate, with our fists balled up under our chins to support our jaws with each bite. We didn't talk about the countless strangers who walked up to Annie and me on the street and encouraged us to smile because either Jesus loved us or it didn't cost a thing. My parents are hippies. In our house on Bunker, we didn't have soda or television or Barbies or Oreos. It was not that these things were forbidden. My parents didn't believe in rules either. There was just an understanding that if my sisters and I liked these things, if we actively wanted these things, these artificially flavored, misogynistic things, Mom and Dad would be so disappointed. Naturally, I craved every taboo, but there was one thing in particular I wanted most of all. At some point during my childhood, my brain had lumped what was wrong with my face into the same category as soda and television. But much, much more than soda or television, I wanted to talk about my face. I wanted to talk about what others seemed to see when they saw my face. But I was convinced that talking about it would elicit the same disappointment that I saw in my parents' eyes when they caught me eating a Little Debbie Swiss cake roll. They had raised me to believe that I was just like everyone else. Suggesting otherwise would do to them what Disability Awareness Day had done to me, shatter the enchantment. Last summer, my friend and I were walking to this bar, and she was telling me this story about a podcast she'd heard. So this guy, she says, had a brain injury. And so he talked really, really slow. But he didn't know that he talked slow until he heard a recording of his voice. I nodded. I know, that's just like me, I said. I didn't realize I spoke differently until I heard a video of a grade school production. What? My friend said. You don't sound different. I was so taken aback that I almost fell down on the sidewalk. This was such a bold lie. But I shouldn't have been surprised. On the rare occasion that I've broached the topic of my disability with friends, I've been told either no one notices or it doesn't matter. In my experience of disability, the people closest to me have always expressed their love by telling me that they almost magically cannot see it. That this thing that has both directly and indirectly shaped so much of my life doesn't matter. Instead, it has been the grade school bullies, the condescending prom queens, and the callous strangers who have been the one to say, I notice. It matters. From day to day, hour to hour, I pitched between having my boyfriend call me beautiful and a boy on the red line call me ugly. From successfully managing a small business to getting a slowly enunciated, saccharine, how are you, from a barista. Some days my perception of myself seems so inextricable from the perceptions of others that the very physiognomy of my face seems mutable. I like to imagine that on Disability Awareness Day, I spit out that glob of marshmallows, turned to the volunteer and said, speech impediment, I think I got this one. But as hard as I try, I can't recall what I said on that day. So I recently called my mom and asked her if she remembered. After I described what happened, there was a long pause. And then she said, you never told me that happened. Her voice was brittle, and I immediately regretted telling her. But then we slowly tripped into the conversation that we had all my life avoided having. She told me how right after I was born, I dropped below my birth weight. 1 week, then 2 weeks, then months passed without me gaining any weight. During those checkups, the words failure to thrive hung in the air. Then, when I turned 6 months old, our family doctor weighed me and smiled. We're in the clear, he said. Mom and Dad smiled, and then the doctor said, what's next? In the half of a year that I'd been alive, neither Mom nor Dad had acknowledged to one another or anyone else that the condition that stilled the muscles in my sister's face had stilled mine as well. Now that it appeared that I'd be sticking around alive for a while, my parents had to choose. Would they pursue the same treatments with Annie, my sister, that they had with me? For her, next had meant infant stimulation therapy, occupational therapy, visits to Buddhist monks and psychics and reflexologists. Whenever these various experts asked Annie to make sounds she couldn't make or create shapes with her mouth that she couldn't create, Annie would reach up and anxiously twirl her pigtails, round and round, as if trying to fast forward her small body past that moment. All of the experts left my parents and Annie disappointed, depleted, and light years away from the bunker, the enchantment. Looking at me, then at one another, Mom and Dad turned to the doctor and shook their heads no. No, there wouldn't be a next, not with this one. And that is when the magical thinking, the enchantment of my childhood began. On the phone, Mom finished the story and then after a pause said, I remember during one of Annie's doctor's appointments, a specialist said to me, what do you want? And I was so angry and so exhausted that I yelled at her, I want the world to be nicer. Annie is perfect. She's perfect. She's perfect. It's the world that needs to change. Pulling the phone away from my face so as not to get it wet with tears, I could hear Mom on the other end of the line, sitting in the same house where I grew up crying. Only then did it occur to me that perhaps my parents needed the enchantment more than I ever did. The day after I spoke to Mom, Annie and I met at a small cafe near my apartment. Annie listened to her as I told her about the phone call with Mom. Then she took a sip of coffee and said, "There are days when I think Mom and Dad did everything wrong. But when I try to flip it on its head and think, what should they have done, I have no idea." I look at my cup of tea and I think about whether or not I should tell Annie that I am, for the first time in my life, considering having children. I know that this new urge is entirely irrational, demanding the same sort of magical thinking that I had moments ago felt compelled to critique. Ever since I talked to Mom, I can't shake the sound of her voice saying, "I want the world to be nicer." 30 years have passed since she said those words, and the world is no nicer now than it was then. I think about the baby that could one day grow inside of me. If she is born with the same condition as me, if she looks up at my face and sees her own reflected, she will know that I knew how hard this would be and that I did it anyway. Yet still, something inside me, however irrational and selfish and delusional, wants to find out. Because yes, I know this will be hard, but whether or not it will also be worth it has nothing to do with magic.